Call the meeting to order. I wish to remind everyone that if you are a town meeting member, you should be sitting in the area that separates the seats from those who are members of the public. And also, apparently, the last meeting we had a couple of town meeting members who decided to sit with some friends in the public, and the checkers get concerned. They think you're a member, but now we know if you're a member because you got your badges on. But it's better to stay on this side if you're going to vote, so that the checkers do get an accurate count if we need to have a counted vote. And then we only have 3 people that this might apply to right now. In the general public area, we would ask everyone to listen, but not to participate by talking between or among yourselves in the public area. I want to check to see if we have a quorum. Mrs. Soros. It's on, they say.
It is? You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Moderator, at the present time, we have 78.
We have 78 voters here. A quorum is 73, so we do have a quorum. Now, the same rules of procedure will apply, and I'm sure everybody can remember what those are, so I don't need to repeat those. So we're basically going back to Article 16. There is a pending amendment that was submitted at the time we recessed by Ms. Urfer, and I'm going to recognize her at this time.
Mr. Moderator, thank you. Kathy Urfer, District 1.
Yes.
I would like to withdraw the amendment at our last part of the meeting in order to substitute agreed upon language that was worked out in between during our recess.
Okay. Unless there's objection, we'll consider the proposal of amendment, which I'm sure we all have forgotten anyway, and permit Ms. Urfer to offer a new amendment to Article 16. You may come up and proceed.
Thanks, sorry. So a couple of the concerns that came up, well, actually 2 people had essentially the same concern, which was that the language that was proposed was not clear enough if a decision had to be made about whether something was a conflict of interest or not. So with that, we changed the language to the following, and there is a new version on the back if anyone wants it. So the proposed new amendment language would be: no member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee shall vote on any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial or personal interest. It is expected that any member with a conflict of interest will fully disclose the nature of their conflict and will recuse him or herself from a vote on the issue at hand. The member with a conflict of interest may participate in the discussion of the issue at hand with the consent of the majority of the remaining members. Any interested person may publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest. In the event that a request is made and the member does not recuse him or herself, the remaining members of the board or committee shall vote on whether the conflict is real and of sufficient importance using the following motion. Do we believe said member does not have well, the actual language is, do we believe member indicated by the request of recusal does not have a conflict of interest and consequently should be allowed to discuss and vote upon the issue at hand?
Is there a second? Second. Motion has been made and seconded. Do you care to speak to that?
I'm glad I'm getting a lot of exercise because we have to actually drive to Syracuse later and I'm going to be in the car. And I'm apologizing now because I will need to leave at 10:30 to do that. I just wanted to mention that I think we've gone through all of these articles, and from my point of view, I have a very personal, the things that trigger me in general in life are issues of justice, fairness, clarity, and responsibility. So my intention here is purely that I feel like the language isn't clear enough to be fair and to make sure that people are acting appropriately. And given the nature of the culture of Brattleboro in Vermont, I acknowledge that it's really rare that you would even necessarily need to think about that, because I think that people are very considerate here and fair and open, and it's a small enough town that we all know what's going on with everyone anyway. But I am concerned that it leaves a gaping hole for someone who might want to come in and take advantage of us, and that could be someone moving here from New York City that buys a lot of land. There's any number of scenarios. So from my point of view, it's really just a basic ethical concern. And so I just wanted to mention that in support of the language change. Thanks.
Question is on the amendment as proposed by Ms. Erfer. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Dimes.
Kurt Dimes, District 2. I just have a small suggestion about the wording. We are very careful to say his or her, except in one instance. In the first sentence it says disclose the nature of their interest. I think if we're going to be serious about the his or her, we should be serious about it in all relevant cases and say the nature of his or her interest.
Mr. Dimes, is that in the first sentence, second sentence, or third sentence?
It's close to the beginning of that, the amendment, sir. Second sentence.
I don't seem to see it there. Unless there's objection, Mr. Dimes has moved that we substitute for the word there in the second sentence in the first paragraph of the amendment, his or her. And unless there's objection, we will just treat that as a friendly amendment, and the question then returns to the issue, shall you adopt the article as amended? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Or, I'm sorry, stand and remain standing. Those opposed, kindly rise. The ayes have it, and you've adopted the amendment to the article. The question now is, shall you adopt the article as amended? All those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes have it, and you've adopted Article 16. We now go to Article 17. Chair recognizes Mrs. Buboulis.
I move that the town approve the technical changes made to Article 2.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded that the town approve the technical changes made to Article 2. Mr. Block.
At the end of each of the following 8 articles, there will be a question similar to this regarding technical changes that the Commission has recommended be made to each article of the Charter, except for Article 1, where no technical changes were made, but only substantial changes. The technical changes don't rise to the level of substantial changes. They are often something as simple as grammar or punctuation, but sometimes a little more complex. They are rearranging of paragraphs, the reordering of language to make things clearer, to be better understood. So that is essentially the scope of technical changes, and these are this is a review of Article 2 and the question therein.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 18? I'm sorry, Article 17. Are you ready for that question, Mr. Agave?
Just for clarification, perhaps the town attorney might take note of this. Article 2 on the, I believe it's H, section 2. It speaks to upon the movement of the election date of town officials to November, and that was defeated. And would it constitute a major or a minor change to remove that paragraph?
Mr. Fisher's interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I believe that would be a minor change, really, given the previous vote. It's a moot issue, so as far as the technical changes would take care of that.
Thank you.
Question is on Article 17. Are you ready for that question? If so, all in favor signify by saying aye or standing. Those opposed? The ayes have it. You've adopted Article 17. Article 18. Chair recognizes Mr. Pillsbury, or Mr. Corum.
Good morning, Mr. Moderator. I'll stand in for Mr. Pillsbury at this point. I move that the town approve amendment to the non-binding initiative process.
Is there a second? Second. Motion has been made and seconded that the town approve an amendment to the non-binding initiative process. Mr. Block.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This and the following 3 amendments are all contained in Article 3, the Powers of the People section of our Charter. It's noteworthy that the Powers of the People article of the Charter, adopted in 1984, precedes the other branches of government, be it the Select Board, Town Manager, Representative Town Meeting. And it is indeed one of the branches of government here, albeit more of a check and balance, than a necessarily proactive one based on the history of our representative democracy, but it is also at times expressed through public petition and public vote. And in our first article here, in considering non-binding initiatives that are essentially an expression of sentiment that are advisory in nature, the Commission has recommended 2 substantial changes to the existing charter pathway. The first of those changes, and if you turn to your existing charter, it might be easier to understand the current language. You can find that on page 3, Article 2, on the left-hand column. It's section 2, it's entitled Initiative, and under capital letter A, it begins the steps for non-binding initiative. Now, heretofore, in order to bring forth a non-binding initiative, 5% of the voters on the checklist must submit a petition and state that it is to be advisory only. And if a qualifying petition comes forward, the select board of the school directors, as it says in B here, shall place the article on the warning for the next town or town school district meeting. However, that language is not specific enough, according to some of the actions of select boards in Vermont, that have caused such a petition process, in our case brought forward by 5% of the voters, or nearly 500 voters, have found that a select board has stepped in occasionally and said, well, we don't think that your petition is relevant to the business of our town, and we believe, therefore, that we have the right not to act. In other words, a right not stated in the charter, but a right that was questioned and has been questioned and decided ultimately at the Supreme Court level of Vermont. And what the Supreme Court of Vermont has decided in a couple of cases is that indeed a select board does have that right if the language in a town charter is not more specific, and in which case the Commission feels that local democracy, expressed in the manner of 500 people bringing forth such a question, is vital enough that 3 people, in the example of our own majority of the select board, should not stand in the way of allowing citizens access to expressing themselves on such a question. The most frequent comment I hear from elected officials that are uncomfortable with the idea of expanding that really speaks to the next substantial change down here in C in the existing charter. Heretofore, a petition that did not fall within 60 days of an upcoming election normally scheduled was subject to a special election in order to hold a vote on a non-binding initiative, and the Commission feels that that's a burden on the town, unwarranted in the sense that it is asking the town to spend time and money on a sentiment-only expression, and we have recommended the removal of that special meeting requirement. In other words, simply put, that a petition brought forward in the initiative process would not occupy any of the time or attention of our select board whatsoever. They simply have the requirement to warn the article at the next regularly scheduled town meeting or representative town meeting, allowing the voters then to weigh in on that expression. The language that the Commission has put in to be more specific, and you can read that in the proposed charter, and you'll find that on page 4 of the proposed charter on the left-hand side, where, and I guess I'll read this quickly. For the purposes of this section, article shall include, but not be limited to, any non-binding question relating to domestic, regional, statewide, national, or international concerns, whether constituting the business to be transacted at any election or not. And furthermore, in 5, no petition shall be rejected for any reason other than insufficient signatures. Thank you.
Question is on Article 18.
Mr. Moderator,
Mr. DeGray.
I'd like to amend the 5% to 10%, and I'd like to speak to that.
Well, Mr. DeGray, I'm not sure if that's apropos to this article, which is Article 18, to approve amendment to the non-binding initiative process. I think the percentages,
I think that's part of, when you are reading this, Mr. Moderator, it states, petition shall have at least 5% of the voters. And so it's part of the language, if you look down, which we're talking about here, this whole section is about the select board rejecting a petition. So this is all part of the language. It's not part of the language that they changed, but it's part of this initiative. And the initiative for article questions is 5% of the voters. And so I'm making a motion to amend that to 10%. That's all part of this article.
okay. Okay. A motion has been made to amend Article 18 by striking 5% and including therein 10%. Is there a second? Okay. Motion has been made and seconded to amend Article 18 as so stated. Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. One of the things, and I do appreciate the Charter Commission moving this to the next town meeting.
Mr. DeGray, we've got a point of order. Mr. Agavi.
I'd like to clarify something. It's my understanding that although proposals that are being put forth here may be amended, that this body cannot make a major change or a new change in the charter. If you look back, I think it's Section 8, where we show the paths by which changes to this charter may be made. The town meeting does have a right to propose changes itself as a body, to propose changes to the charter, but if it's a major change, it has to be warned so the rest of the town, the citizens, have a chance to look at what this body is up to. 5%, the percent is a pretty major element. And although this body may recommend it, it would have to be the rest of the town would have to have a chance to consider it.
Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. As this question came up with the Charter Commission, and it has been our firm's legal opinion that these articles for which you are voting on both at the last meeting and this continued meeting may be amended, and that's because these recommendations are made by the Charter Commission, and then pursuant to Article, which was 7 in the old charter and the proposed Article 8 for the new charter, talks about being approved pursuant to the previous section, which was the representative town meeting. That's the meeting at which you're at currently. So given that it's not Australian ballot and it's a meeting of this body, these articles, so long as it is held to be in order and germane to the question or the article at hand by the moderator, these can be amended. So there is no distinction between minor and major other than what the moderator would deem to be germane to the issue.
Now, you referred to Article 7 in the present.
Yes.
Charter.
Which is the amendment section of, that section talks about how this charter can be amended. And to remind everyone how we got here, these are recommendations made pursuant to Article 7D, which is the recommendation of the Charter Revision Commission, and then that says, and approved in the same manner as provided under paragraph C. If you go up to C, halfway down, third line down, it says, and approved at the next annual town meeting or special town meeting, which is what we're at, held not less than 60 days following such public meeting. They're public meetings where the meeting's held in September, I believe. So this is more than 60 days from that.
Okay.
And obviously, all of these are subject to the approval of the state legislature. So in other words, getting back to the issue at hand as to the 5%, that is part of Article 3, Section 2 on the initiative, and it is the moderator's decision as to whether an amendment to that section is germane to the Article 18, which makes changes to that Section 2.
Okay. Mr. Block.
I would suggest that it is not germane, only in as much as the recommendations of the Commission on this particular section are limited to a specific pathway that allows voters confidence that if they petition for a non-binding initiative, it shall be acted upon. That has nothing to do with how many votes or how many signatures are needed to bring forth an initiative. It simply clarifies what shall happen after the petitions have been turned in and qualified.
Yes, we do.
Oh, you do.
We do.
Mr. Sprick, I'm sorry, what was your point of order? Okay.
The only other change in this that's being recommended, as I stated previously, was the elimination of the need for a special town meeting or representative town meeting in order to hold such a vote. It is not germane, in my opinion, that what Mr. DeGray recommends as an amendment should be discussed herein, any more so than discussing whether or not we should have a mayoral form of government should be discussed when we talk about having a select board of a different size or having the town manager have an established article in the charter.
Okay. Ms. Herfer.
I feel like we're having since the amendment has been seconded, I'd really like to hear from Mr. DeGray what his reasoning is.
Well, I think there's a point of order that's been raised as to whether or not we should consider it at this time. The chair's indication will be, let's take the amendment up and let's see if it passes. Then I'll take up any further amendments at that time. So at this time, Mr. DeGray, I'm going to rule that your amendment is out of order at this time.
Is it out of order?
Yes, at this time. If the amendment, if this article is adopted, then you have the right at that time to reoffer it.
Backwards. Backwards.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. get to. The chair was trying to create something that we all could understand, but I got myself into a box that I could never get out of. I think that the question now is this germane to the article at hand? And based on germaneness, which is defined as an amendment that must in some way involve the same question that is raised by the motion to which it is applied, namely it must be relevant and pertinent, the chair would rule that this percentage figure is relevant, and we have to take it up at this time, because if the article is adopted, the only way we can then take it up again after that would be to have a reconsideration, and I think we might as well face it head on right now so that we don't get ourselves into further complications. Now, having said that, I think I've got to go back to Mr. DeGray for explanation. Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you for your stewardship here also. The reason that I made this amendment is twofold. One of the things here in the language that's proposed is that you are eliminating your elected officials to reject petitions that are really not relevant to the town's business. And I can understand that. If, you know, that's, you feel that any time someone wants to bring an article question forward that doesn't have anything to do with the town, well, one of the things you do is you eliminate the elected officials and you say, let's go forward with that petition. But there's a cost factor here.
Point of order.
There's a,
Okay. You may proceed.
there's a cost, there's a couple things that are going on here. There is a cost factor. For the Mr. Dimes's petition in the fall, there was a $3,000 cost for that petition to put that on the ballot. There's also an emotional issue. Now, when we had the Bush-Cheney article, there were hundreds and hundreds of emails, thousands of emails that came into our town. We had to take special precautions. Up at the voting place that day, there was a fear of a bomb scare. And so if we are going to remove your elected officials as saying, we don't think this is germane to town business, then let's raise the standard. Let's raise the standard up to 1,000 votes here, which I think that's what 10% is. That would make it a little bit more of a hurdle to get some of these questions forward. If you feel that taking your elected officials out of this process is what you truly want to do, then raise the standard. Every time someone wants to put an article question on, there's a cost that everybody bears, and whether you agree with that article and what its significance is, all you do is go out and get 500 signatures, and people don't really, a lot of people don't know what they're signing. They don't understand. You hear the one side of the issue that the petitioner has. It's just what we do. I would be doing the same thing if I had the petition. I'd only be giving you my side of the story. So my feeling is that if you truly want this language, then let's raise the standard. Let's raise that figure, that it might hold back some of these, which I call frivolous emotional issues that we don't have any authority to act on. Certainly the Bush-Cheney one wasn't. And, you know, when people are fearing for their safety, that's a concern that we all should have, whether we agree or disagree with the petition that's at hand.
Question is on the DeGray amendment. Mr. Block.
There are several things there that Mr. DeGray stated, some of which are just simply not true. First of all, there is no $3,000 cost associated with initiatives. The only reason that an additional cost has been incurred is because the process was interrupted by the select board not being comfortable with the proposed initiative in that particular case. The select board is not being taken out of the process at all. They have every right to debate it, to vote on it, and to act upon it if they choose. They simply cannot block the people from having a part of this process. And essentially, what's being recommended here in this amendment is taking the people further away from the process itself by raising a bar to a standard that is heretofore higher than the standard of bringing forth a charter amendment, for instance. The state statute on charter amendments is 5% of the voters' signatures. And here we're asking for a non-binding initiative, much less significant than a charter change, to require a bar double the size of what it takes to bring forth a binding charter amendment question. That seems ironic to me. And to say that people don't understand what they're signing, to me, I think is indicative of the whole concept that there are some people that just don't think the people should weigh in at all. And perhaps this article, the entire article of the powers of the people, be rescinded.
Question is on the DeGray amendment. Ms. Cappy?
Thank you, Annette Cappy, District 1, and I'm also the town clerk. And I would like to say something about Larry's comment about the $3,000. Simply to print the ballot is $3,000. That had nothing to do with the delay with the select board. The cost of printing a ballot goes by the number of ballots you have printed up and the number of characters. So the longer the question, the more expensive the ballot is. The ballot cost was $3,000. The cost for the gymnasium, if we were to have a special election just for one article, the gymnasium runs about, at the high school, about close to $1,000 just to use that. Then you pay the ballot clerks, and you publish in the newspaper, and I think publishing in the paper is probably several $100s, I think. Okay, and I'm not saying that that we should be putting a price on democracy. I just want you to know what the actual cost of a special article is. And the other thing, if I may, goes back to people signing petitions. And we have people that sign petitions, and I appreciate what Larry's saying, and I think some people that sign petitions put a lot of thought into it and care about the cause that they're signing. But a lot of people will sign 2 and 3 times, and they don't even know what they're signing. They sign the same petition just to get someone out of their face. So I just had to say that, Larry. I'm sorry.
Questions on the DeGray amendment, Mr. Sprite?
I have a question for Annette. This proposed article includes eliminating the possibility of having a special town meeting, so it would be on the same ballot and it would be at the same time as something else. So can you tell us what kind of a difference it would make if it's just on a ballot that's already being printed at a time that we're already voting?
If it fit on a ballot, if there were room on the ballot, it would be included. That also works for a ballot in November or September that the state does. If we have a local article and we have it in time and it could go on the November or September ballots, the state would pay for their ballot. We would only pay the difference in the cost. I would say it's probably about $1,000 if we were to add it on to an already existing ballot.
For all the costs. Yeah.
That's just the printing.
Yeah.
That's just the printing.
And
the
since
other
we
costs
already
would be
have the
absorbed.
space and the people and so forth, that wouldn't be additional.
If that part of the
Yeah.
article goes through, you know, maybe I'll speak to that when we get to that, I guess.
Okay. I'd like to speak strongly against the amendment and in favor of the article. We have had some very important, perhaps not immediately and directly related to the town issues come up, but that people felt strongly about. And to say that it has nothing to do with the town when we have a bridge right in the center of town who is named after a poor young man who paid a much higher price than we will ever pay for adventures that have happened on the national level, that we ended up effectively speaking out on as a result of our efforts. To say that's not relevant to the town, I think is absurd. We flexed our little muscles here in the 12,000 person town here in a way that was on more than one occasion quite meaningful. We've had other situations where we've gotten national attention for things that have directly to do with the town and perhaps inadequate supervision of our police department. That has directly to do with the town, and that is your responsibility. When 500 citizens speak, whether all of them are thinking all the way through the process or not, there are still a significant number of them who are, and it's close to, 4 times the number of us who are supposed to be gathered here today. So I think it would be presumptuous of us as a body, let alone presumptuous of the select board, to say that when 500 people go to the trouble of signing a petition, and someone went to the trouble of drafting it and circulating it, it would be presumptuous to not put it before the voters. So I urge everybody to vote against this amendment and pass the article. Thank you.
Mr. Mccarty.
Scott Mccarty, District 3. I support the amendment just because if we are going to be passing this, I think it would just be a very good idea. Our population is at a level right now that I think 500 people doesn't represent the entire community of Brattleboro. So I think that enlarging it to the level that Mr. DeGray is recommending is apt. But also I wanted to kind of focus on the fact that we elect our select board much as we elect our legislature to serve as a filter. Because I can only imagine if the legislature wasn't in place, which passes and filters out referendum that goes to the state for voters to approve, what kind of referendums we could be having to vote on every single November. So I think that having the select board serve as a filter for that is necessary. It has nothing to do with the Bush-Cheney article, which I did vote for. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with this situation that we elect them to represent us. They should, and I trust them, to filter out some of these referendums that are not germane to the more pressing issues that our town is facing on a daily basis, like, I don't know, building a new police station, for instance. So I think this is something that's very much appropriate. I would urge folks that if we are going to pass, if we do want to approve this article, that we do it with Mr. DeGray's amendment. So I'd urge folks to support this amendment.
Questions on the amendment by Mr. DeGray? Ms. Baboulas?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. 5% is essentially what the state statute allows. So essentially what you're saying is that the people of Brattleboro would have less than what is available to the rest of the citizens of the state. The reason why it's 5% is because it matches the statute that the state has. I just want to say that there are a lot of different ways to think about the idea of time being spent on things that may not be germane. This is essentially, I remember when the members of the Charter Commission were explaining this, talking about this article back when they were doing their informational meetings. This is essentially a valve. It's a steam valve. It allows people who feel really strongly about an issue for which the select board does not want to consider to be able to bring it up as an issue and express a sentiment. And that's all it is. It's about expressing a sentiment. Now, if you remove that ability for people to be able to do that and make it more difficult, then essentially what you do is you put them in the select board room on a bi-weekly basis in which they're going to express their sentiment in ways that are going to be disruptive. And so when if you're thinking about the idea of wasting time and wasting money, you have to look at the whole picture. And we're talking about a non-binding resolution. We're talking about something that just is that, a political voice. And to me, it's undemocratic to be thinking about making it more difficult for people. It's really, really hard to get 5%. 10% would be beyond the ability of most people to be able to get. It's really hard. It's why we have that threshold for zoning ordinances, because it is really difficult to get that many signatures. And in the end, you still are voting on it. So so people get the opportunity to be able to vote it up or down. The majority of the people will express that sentiment. Thank you.
Question is on the Gray Amendment. Mr. Wimberding?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Wilmerding, District 3. I believe that if this body were to try to change that % requirement, the public will demand that it be returned to what it is. I think that it's arrogant of this body to consider reducing the powers of the people when it's the powers of the people which are supreme in our republic and in our democracy. We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and we cannot allow a few elected representatives to overturn the power of the people.
Question is on the Gray Amendment. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Orion Barber, District 1. The matter of who is representing us has come up in the discussion. We represent our districts. Our elected boards represent all of us. Our state reps represent us as well. That's not the end of the people who represent us. We have a bunch of wonderful folks down in Washington who represent us and who cannot be present in all the towns of Vermont to find out what people are thinking. They get a certain amount of it, but they don't get it all. So I think it's really important to remember that a non-binding sentiment by any community on an issue that the community as a whole feels is important, that voice can reach a long way. Now, are we not human? Do we not bleed? Do we not stumble and fall? Can we not be stupid? Of course we can. Will we be in the future? You bet. And sometimes we will have a good idea. I ask you all to think back to the insane period that a great many of us lived through when this country and the Soviet Union were just poised on a knife edge for years, terrified of each other and threatening to blow each other off the map. And you will remember the insane, quixotic, sane freeze movement, where little voices began springing up all over the country and all over the world saying, "This is nuts, stop this." And eventually, it wasn't totally stopped, but it was dialed way down. That's the power, the good power that a non-binding initiative can have. We hope that our electorate will vote just the way we think they ought to, and sometimes we ourselves will vote stupidly. But sometimes we will be very wise, and it would be a good idea to keep the pathway for that electorate wisdom to get through.
Questions on the Gray Amendment? Mr. Harvey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. George Harvey, District 3. I really want to thank Mr. Barber for his brief speech. I want to call attention, though, to a single word that was in it and could easily have been ignored, and that word is little. The idea of a non-binding resolution being brought forward by a group of people is like hearing a bunch of people in the back of the room, a very small, little bunch of people saying, wait a minute, what about our concern? This is an issue that has been important since the beginning of our democracy, and I've seen people try to come up with solutions. They're not easy. You know, I remember Lonnie Guinier was removed from the consideration for a position in Washington because she had written a paper on exactly this issue. I want to consider the idea of 5% and what little means. How many black people are there in Brattleboro? If each black person in Brattleboro got 10 people to sign a petition, would we have 5%? I don't know. How many American Indians are there in Brattleboro? If every one of them got 100 people to sign a petition, would that make 5%? I don't know. If every Unitarian in Brattleboro, would that constitute 5%? I don't know. But the issue here is somebody is saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong. Please consider this. And to raise the bar to 10% is basically to say, shut up. We don't want to hear you because your voice isn't loud enough. And not being loud enough doesn't mean not being right. Not being loud enough doesn't mean not being worthy of consideration. There are wacky things that come up. I love wacky things. There are important things that come up, and I hate to see one get lost.
Questions on the Degree Amendment? Mr. Herzog.
George Herzog, District 1. I think we have to consider that 5% may be okay, but if it's automatic that the vote would go to that it would be a vote, it's a problem. I don't think that 500 is 5% of the population. I think 5% of the people who vote of the list would be more like 300. How many voters are they, registered voters? 5,000? 9,000? Okay, so it's 450. How many?
416 right now.
the problem also is that more is not always better. There's a country which has a system where everybody can make a petition, and the whole country has to vote. As a result, they vote every 3 weeks, almost. It's Switzerland. And you may remember that a couple of months ago, they voted not to have any mosque in the country. And it was passed because people are so tired, nobody goes to vote. The best votes have draw maybe 16% of the population. Most of the votes are probably 2 or 3% of the population who goes voting because there are just so many. So we need a way to cut down, otherwise we might be voting once a month on this issue or the other.
Questions on the DeGray amendment? Are you ready for that question? Mr. Agave?
I think it should be noted, and you all should note, that the non-binding initiative does not require a special town vote. In fact, it says very specifically that the issue would not be voted on or talked about by town meeting until the next regularly scheduled meeting. So there are no additional costs. Anyway, there's no more cost than writing a bond issue on a ballot. We talk constantly about whether 5% of the voters represents the town. The 5% only gives the rest of the town a chance to talk about it. The 5% does not decide the issue. And I think we mix that up. We seem to think that if 5% needs to represent the whole town, if so, then that would end it right there. If you could turn in a petition with 10%, and we could consider that the voice of the town, there would be no need to talk about it. It would be decided right there. But it's not. We only use the 5% to bring the issue to the table. There's also the issue of the town's business. When someone says this or is not the town's business, who is the town? It is you. You decide what your business is. We decide what our business is. The select board does not decide what our business is. They carry out our business. We delineate very carefully which issues the select board shall deal with and what they shall not deal with, and we reserve the right to deal with whatever issues we wish. But it is the people of this town that have all the power and the ultimate decision about who talks about what. I also find myself a little bit disturbed about the reference that if we talk about a subject that is touchy, there might be some hate calls. That's fear-mongering. That completely strips away our courage, our rights, our honor as a citizen. And if we are to say we will not talk about anything to which some nut or some number of nuts might rise up in anger against, we have been silenced as a people. We have silenced ourselves. We cannot do that, otherwise we lose everything that we have. And last, and this goes back to in some sense the legitimacy of the whole discussion. If it were possible to change the percent from 5 to 10, would it not also be possible to change it from 5% to 40%, to 50%? If there's 80 people in this room, 41 of us could decide on a percent that would essentially usurp the people's power. And I don't believe that we really have that right here. that it is a good question. Whether it's 5% or 6 or 8 or 10 is a good question. But it needs to be debated thoroughly, and that's why it has to be on a separate proposal and a warning. Thank you.
Questions on the DeGray amendment? Ms. Manning?
Sherry Manning, District 1. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I believe that we were only in this discussion about increasing it to 10% because of the language that was put in here in terms of saying neither body shall deny the petition or refuse to place it on the warning. I'm trying to not get into the emotional debate in terms of how are the people, because we are all the people, and all of our representatives are the people. So if we could get back to the business at hand in terms of talking about how we pay for our representation and how we process the voice in terms of that ballot. And it does seem that we have to balance our checkbook and pay for things. Granted, it wouldn't be an additional amount if it's in that article, but for the population, if we really want participation, and we're talking about trying to get more people to participate, it seems to me that it would behoove us to go talk to more people about whatever the issue is. It could be a lot of people that are not in these rooms or are not on the board. So increasing the amount of people to sign the petition seems to me to get to the bottom line, to get more people involved in those issues. And that is why I think at the bottom line, I am definitely supporting increasing it to 10% because of that case.
Questions on the DeGray amendment? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor of the DeGray amendment kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The noes have it, and the amendment is defeated. The recurring question is, shall you adopt Article 18? Are you ready for that question? Mr. Coram.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. 2 points. One is I see in Article 3, Section 1, and this is a minor, probably amendment, but wherever the word town appears has been capitalized. In the beginning of Section 2, the introductory sentence, the town is not capitalized. Is there a reason for that? And that also is under Section 2, A1. The word town appears twice on the 3rd line and on the 5th line in that section, and that's not capitalized. Is there a reason for that? That is the T.
Mr. Block.
Good catch. No, and indeed those should be capitalized. We attempted to make all the capital letters, but we missed a couple. Thank you.
Okay. Also, that's in the last line of new section 2 as well. It's interesting, Mr. Moderator, if I might, with respect to this amendment, you know, if something is so important that 416 or 445, 450 people sign a petition, and that were to occur today, for example, whatever it might be, might be something about what's happening in Egypt. Under this proposal, that would not, if I'm correct, and I may be corrected by Mr. Fisher, that could not get on town meeting until 2012. Is that correct? So, you know, I'm not so sure that what is proposed here is really accomplishing what people might want we the people, to be able to do. Because let's say someone gets a petition about something about Egypt, which is, you know, the big issue in the news today, and we want to do something about that, and we want to have a town-wide vote on that. That won't happen till March of 2012. Hopefully by then that situation is completely resolved. So I think that we're, you know, maybe cutting off her nose to spite her face here to go to this proposal. I think it's best to leave it as it is, and that's why I'm considering not voting for this amendment.
Question is on Article 18. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Beatty?
Bob Beatty, District 1. I guess I've been involved in a few of these petition things over the last several years, gone to the select board several times. I've had to deal with the select board that felt that a question about Vermont Yankee really wasn't the town's business. You know, I thought that was pretty unnecessary. There was recently a court case where the select board refused to warn something where all the signatures had been gathered, and my understanding was the select board lost that court case. Took a lot of time. I really don't see a constructive role for the select board in these situations. I don't think that the select boards are a guardian. I'm not sure even what the phrase was, but it was a guardian of something, that the select board was a guardian of public opinion or public morality or the town's business or something like that. It's just, if anything, when the select board refuses to warn something, it sensationalizes it and it squashes democracy. And, you know, maybe sometimes these things are silly, but if people go through the effort of getting the votes together, it should be warned. And sometimes they're very significant. And I know that select board members with different political opinions will vote against something because they're supporters of Vermont Yankee, for instance, and they don't want to see a ballot question on Vermont Yankee. They know that, and I know that. So I wholeheartedly support this change to the charter. Thank you.
Question is on the degree, on Article 18. Mr. Elwell.
Corwin Elwell, District 3. I'm against this, not the entire article, but there are some sections of this which I think are very dangerous. And I'm going to be accused of being anti-democracy, but so be it. Selectmen's responsibility is an awesome responsibility. They've got a budgets of over $20 million to deal with. They've got issues that come up twice a month that are completely unexpected on some occasions. In other occasions, they have plenty of time to consider what's about to be decided. I don't think they need to be considering national and international issues, and there is a way to approach those from the power of the people. We have a congressional delegation, and I think our national constitution provides, in fact, for petitioning your national government. So if people are exercised to the point where they think that we need to get that issue on the table, then it's my opinion that a petition be submitted to our congressional delegation, to the president, to anybody else that has the power to deal with that issue. The selectmen do not have that power. And I realize that people think that getting it in the national press may be of some help to getting it resolved. Some of you probably are familiar with what's happened in California and other western states where they have petitions for referendums on a regular basis. They're on the ballot every November, and some of them have been very, very dangerous. Proposition 13 in California has destroyed the local government in California. They used to have the premier education system in the country, and today it is probably about number 49, all resulting from the fact that they completely prevented local communities from raising sufficient funds to fund education. In California, if you have lived in your house for 30 years, you're very fortunate, because they cannot raise the assessment more than 2% a year. However, if you buy a house or bought a house within the last year, the assessment on that house is exactly what you paid for the house. And that's why they've dried up the funding that's available for local government. Past advisory petitions in Brattleboro have often been used to chastise the Board of Selectmen because they didn't follow what the petitioners wished them to do. And they were considered to be advisory petitions. And I think that's very unfair. It puts the board in a position of saying, well, we're not going to do it because you think we ought to do it. But it means that the petitioners are not following the petition as it was originally envisioned as an advisory petition. The Supreme Court in Vermont decided about 4 years ago now, in a case in South Burlington where the city council was petitioned to put an article dealing with the abortion issue before the people of South Burlington. The council refused to do that because it was not germane to the business of South Burlington. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided they did not have to put it before the people. And some of you will say, well, that was an incorrect decision, and so be it. But that's the law as the Supreme Court in Vermont sees it at the present time. And it is my opinion that a couple of changes in what has been proposed are necessary in order to prevent the kinds of wrangling that goes on when a petition is presented to the board and then the board wrestles with whether it's to be presented to the people. If you look at Article 3, Section 2A, subsection 2, it's on page 4 of the revised charter. The last sentence in Section 2 reads as follows: neither body shall deny the petition or refuse to place it on a warning on the grounds that the body considers the matters raised in the petition frivolous or not to be business of the town. And I would move that that sentence be removed from the article that's on the floor at the moment. I would further move that in Section 4, 2 words be removed, the words national and the words international, because, again, I don't believe that the select board nor the town have any authority in dealing with a petition of this kind. The petition ought to go to the congressional delegation and or the president or other people that really have the authority to deal with those kinds of things. So I would propose that amendment, Mr. Moderator, of those issues. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Elwell, I think it might be good if we discussed those separately and voted on them separately. Is that okay with you? Okay. So the first question is there a second to Mr. Elwell's amendment of Section 2 by striking the last sentence in that paragraph in its entirety? Okay. We'll take that discussion up at this point. Mr. Wheelock.
Marshall Wheelock, District 2. Unfortunately, I was born in Brattleboro, which means that somewhere in my DNA there's a few references to being a progressive, so I probably am going to support this motion at some stage along the way. But I'm rising now to speak in favor of Mr. Elwell's amendment because I've been very bothered by this. Obviously, somebody has been very upset in the past because we have 3 distinct references in here. Mr. Elwell has addressed 2 of them, saying that if a petition is presented to the board, they have to put it up for vote. I think maybe somebody's emotions took over when they were drafting this, and they didn't stop to think that one of them would be sufficient. So I definitely am in favor of this motion, his second motion, and I think somebody should probably address paragraph number 5, which is the 3rd reference in this article that says if a petition is presented, it may not be denied by either the select board or the school board. Thank you.
Questions on the Elwell First Amendment? Are you ready for that question? Yes. The Elwell First Amendment is in Article 3, Section 2A, number 2, by striking out the language, neither body shall deny the petition or refuse to place it on the warning on the grounds that the body considers the matters raised in the petition frivolous or not to be business of the town. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Phillips.
Thank you. Steve Phillips, District 3. I'm not sure whether Mr. Elwell's intent is to just say this language is surplus and the other language excuse me, is sufficient to deny the select board the authority to decide not to put a petition on the ballot. I don't think that's the case. And if we remove this language, I think it makes it confusing because it says in one place shall put it on the ballot, and then we're not answering the question that Mr. Block thought was so important, which is to make it crystal clear that the select board does not have the authority to hold it back. So I'm not in support of this amendment.
Questions on the Elwell First Amendment?
Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Elwell.
Answer your question. Again, the board has an awesome responsibility, and one of their responsibilities is to respond to local issues. And if a petition comes in dealing with a local issue or even a state issue, I don't have any problem with a state issue even, then it's their responsibility to deal with it and put it on the agenda for a general vote. That's my opinion. However, the word frivolous in there can mean most anything in the world. And that's what I really object to. And that last sentence says that the board has to accept a frivolous, what some of us would consider frivolous and non-germane to local government, and that's it.
Question is on the amendment of Mr. Elwell. Ms. Cappy.
Thank Thank you. Annette Cappy, Town Clerk. Speaking to Mr. Elwell's amendment, if you want to take out the last portion, neither body shall deny, would you also need to take out above that on the, like the 5th line down, shall place the article on the warning? Would that have to be changed to may? It says requesting an article to reflect public sentiment to be voted upon by all the voters of the town shall place, because I think shall is what's on there now. And even if this were taken out, if your section were taken out, the article would still have to go on the ballot because of the court decision on the Dimes case. So I almost think that maybe that would need to be changed also.
I agree with your position, yes.
Yes, point of order. Mr. Wheelock.
Marshall Wheelock, District 2. I think the response to Ms. Cappy's question could be found in the second portion of Mr. Elwell's motion, where under number 4 for this article, section 2, he's which defines article. He would remove national or international, thereby making the definition of article something that is non-binding question relating to domestic, regional, statewide concerns. So when the two are taken together, it doesn't mean that they have to automatically place whatever the petition question is on the ballot. They only would if the article as defined in number 4 is presented to them. So if the effect would be to grant the board the right not to include questions of national or international concern, and I believe that was the thrust of Mr. Elwell's concern. Am I correct? Thank you.
Questions on the First Amendment of Mr. Dimes? Mr. Davis.
Thank you. I'm Andy Davis, District 3. Just on this issue of the language, I would agree that someone is very concerned about there being gates, because it comes up in number 2 of Section A. It also comes up in 4 and in 5. It seems to me that 5, and I don't know, Mr. Elwell, whether you commented on 5. Number 5, if everyone would just take a look at that under Section A. No petition shall be rejected for any reason other than insufficient signatures. I mean, if you leave that in, doesn't that cover it? Why do we need to be talking about frivolity? Maybe you could address that. But it seems to me that that is clear as a bell. We don't need to talk about frivolous, national, intergalactic. If number 5 is no petition shall be rejected for any reason other than insufficient signatures, please respond to that. Thank you.
Yes, I completely agree that that also ought to be removed in order to give the Board of Selectmen the discretion to deal with whatever the issue is that the petition may refer to.
Okay, Mr. Block.
I'd like to clarify how this language came about. It was authored by Paul Gillis, who is one of the state's foremost charter attorneys. The specificity here, according to Mr. Gillis, I don't mean to speak for him, but this is our understanding, is essential. Every single specific redundant word of it. The reason being is that it is not sufficient in a town charter to say the select board shall do something. That sounds in common sense to be specific enough, but it is not in case law. Case law requires that every time there's a case brought forth where on a technicality or on a word turns the decision, in order to redress that, a town's charter must be more specific than the case law that has come before it. Hence, all of these words are in here in order to assure the voters a pathway to being able to act on a question, to express a sentiment in an advisory-only, non-binding vote. Mr. Elwell's amendment is moot and unnecessary. It's simply a matter of up or down on the original amendment, for if this body chooses to reject the proposed amendment, the simplest way is to reject the original article, which it has the same effect of just keeping the existing charter as it is, which essentially grants the select board carte blanche to decide what it is that they want to do every time they are presented with such a petition.
Questions on the amendment proposed by Mr. Elwell? Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. With regard to Mr. Block's last statement there, that if you reject Article 18, that restores to the Select Board the ability to determine what is germane and not germane, that is not true because of Mr. Dimes's lawsuit, which he prevailed in the Superior Court. That was not appealed to the Supreme Court, so that stands as an order for the town of Brattleboro. So with the Dimes lawsuit, essentially, if people didn't read it in the papers, essentially says that in our charter, in the existing charter, the word shall means shall, and that if there is a petition with 5%, that then gets put on because the charter was very specific on that matter. So if this body wishes to have the Select Board determine what is germane and not germane to town or local or state business, then you would consider Mr. Elwell's amendment along with the changes for the definition of what article means. It could also mean, and it's not for me to make amendments, but the word shall could be changed to may. That's obviously the policy decision that this body needs to make. But I just wanted to be clear that if Article 18 is defeated, the Superior Court holding in Mr. Dimes's case remains the order for the town of Brattleboro. Thank you.
Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Orion Barber, District 1. This whole matter of frivolity and non-germaneness and so forth is something that I really didn't elect my select board to deal with. I elected my select board to deal with police, roads, all that other stuff that we're so familiar with that affect my existence here in this town. I didn't elect them to deal with national issues, and I don't want them spending time on it. National issues, however, do affect me. They affect everybody. So I want issues that others may feel, oh, that's way beyond us. Who are we, poor little things? We have no business thinking about those. I want those issues to come in to town government. Town manager will say to the select board, well, we got a non-binding initiative to go on the warning. Select board says, okay, whack, stamp, goes on, and they don't talk about it. Of course, we're all human beings. We're going to talk about it, But that's not what I elected them to do, so I'm just trying to clear the decks for them so that our little voice can maybe get heard by people down in Washington and some other people in the country, and maybe something will happen.
Question is on the First Amendment of Mr. Elwell. Mr. Sprite.
It seems to all boil down to whether we're in favor of public frivolity or not. So I'd like to suggest that we move the question.
Is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded that debate cease. All in favor kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Favor of ceasing debate on the amendment. Those opposed? I'm going to ask the checkers to actually make a count here. It needs to be a 2/3 vote to cease debate. So all in favor of ceasing debate, and this is just on the Elwell First Amendment, kindly rise. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of ceasing debate, 41. Those opposed, 33. A 49 vote was necessary, so debate will continue. Yes, Mr. Dudman.
The thrust of the use of the word frivolous simply is saying, what I may consider frivolous, you don't. So the frivolous in there is simply saying, eliminating the possibility that it doesn't matter how serious something is that comes forward to you. Since I'm the judge, I can say that it's frivolous. And that's the only reason that word is there. To eliminate me coming from my perspective to say that that's frivolous because it's not of interest to me.
Question is on the Mr. Beeman? Penniman, I'm sorry.
Bill Penniman, District 3. This may be out of order, but considering what we're discussing, we've got words in paragraph 2, words in paragraph 4, and the whole of paragraph 5, all of which come down to whether or not the select board will be able to decide whether a valid petition should be voted on or not. And discussing these one at a time, I think, is going to drag us on and on. I would suggest that we look at that, get a sense of the meeting as to whether they feel the select board should have that sort of power, and then work on these words all as one package, similar to what we did earlier with the first article today. That's my comment.
Well, I think what we could do, we could take a vote as to whether or not this article will pass in some form. Advisory vote only. And then we can go to the specifics. But I really think it depends on what the specifics are in each case in order to pass the article at the end. So let's continue to see if we can't get to each article, or we've got basically 2 amendments that Mr. Elwell has offered, and those are the only 2 that are going to be voted on at this point. So let's continue, and I'll take...
District 3. That's a fairly important distinction to hold in our heads as we figure out a process for this, because that change of that one word in conjunction with striking that last sentence completely, it actually becomes a proxy vote for the article as a whole, because if we accept that amendment language with may and strike that last paragraph, we're essentially being fairly explicit about trying to return that power to the select board. So if we need to be just clear that that was accepted as a friendly amendment as we talk about it, because you did say that it was.
Okay, but I don't think we actually took a vote on it.
No, but I'm sorry, I mean, it has a friendly amendment to his amendment. So when we go to vote on this amendment, okay, the language is going to be changed from shall to may as part of that vote.
Okay, I understand. Mr. Cox.
I'm thankful for Bob Fisher's clarification of what our fallback position is. I found it helpful to go back to our town charter as it's currently written, and again, I think he referred to Article 3, Section 2, Part 1B. The select board or the school directors, upon receipt of such petition, shall place the article on the warning for the next town or town meeting or district meeting. And he's clarified that this has been upheld in court, so that the select board do not have currently any option in considering whether a petition shall go on the agenda or not. So in changing this word to may, we are changing the intent of the charter as it currently exists to give a power to the select board that they do not currently have. So I just wanted to that point I think was clarified to me, and I hope that is correct, or that I will be corrected. The other part of looking at the article as a whole is that currently the select board are required to call a special town meeting for an article, a petition that comes before them, if there's more than 60 days between the time that petition is presented and the next regularly scheduled town meeting. That requirement, by the recommendation of our commission, our charter commission, is being lifted, so that we as a body will no longer have the expense, the right that when someone does a petition, it means it's going to go on to a regular ballot or a regular meeting, that we're not going to call special meetings in relation to these petitions. I think that that's a position we haven't really gotten to, but I support. I see the intent of the amendments that we're looking at here, that is the amendments, the changes to our town charter, as clarifying. And I appreciate Mr. Block's explanation of the reason for doing this is that we've gotten into trouble before because it doesn't seem as though the intent is clear, so the recommendation is to be over clear. So I see the overall direction here as reducing the involvement of the town through special town meetings around petition items, and keeping in place what we currently have in the current charter and in the current law.
Mr. Block.
With all due respect to Mr. Fisher, I disagree with your legal interpretation about the current district court ruling's impact on our charter. My understanding from other counsel is that that ruling, because it stopped at the district court level, leaves the door open for a Supreme Court in Vermont to decide otherwise. It does not stop the Select Board from acting as they have in the past or as they may in the future with regarding whether or not they decide by a 3-2 or other majority vote to not act upon a non-binding initiative brought to them. There may be some consequences, but ultimately it's likely those consequences will be debated in the Supreme Court, where the case law requires the specificity that is being recommended here today.
Mr. Fisher.
Just don't want to get into a big legal debate here. Mr. Block is correct that that was a Superior Court decision. It is not a Supreme Court decision of the state of Vermont. That part is absolutely correct. So it is not the law of the land for the state of Vermont. However, if you have the same issue come up, namely the issue of a petition for an advisory vote that may deal with something that some people deem to be germane to town business and others don't, and that goes to Superior Court with the same guiding document, the existing charter, then the Dimes decision will be the rule of the case, and essentially to be able to get around that, you would need to get around the doctrines of res judicata, which is the same matter being tried once before being tried again, or what's called collateral estoppel, which is essentially issue preclusion. So those would be the challenges to trying to come at that in Superior Court on a similar issue. So that's what courts were made for. Keeps lawyers in business. My point here is today you can, with regard to the charter amendment, you can legislate over the court decision if you so choose. And that's really what you're deciding upon in these the Elwell amendment here. Thank you.
Questions on the Elwell amendment? Mr. Harvey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. George Harvey, District 3. I've got a couple of things to say, one of which is regarding the business of the Supreme Court versus the Superior Court. As I understand it, if an issue like this came up in a town where there has been no ruling, it could be ruled differently by the Supreme Court than it has been by the Superior Court, and that would change the Select Board's ability to deal with things, because it would mean that the Superior Court has effectively said that the Supreme Court has effectively said that the Superior Court's ruling was wrong. Now, perhaps I'm wrong about that, but that's my understanding. The second thing that I'd like to say is we're talking about frivolity here. I don't believe that the question of whether something is frivolous belongs in a legislative or executive body at all. It belongs in the judiciary and should not be considered by the Select Board. And the second issue is in terms of the question of local versus national, international, or whatever. Our young men and women, National Guard, can be put in Afghanistan by the President of the United States. And as much as I like Bernie and all of the people that we have in Washington, D.C., they're not going to be there forever, and they're not always going to agree with me, and they're not always going to agree with everybody else. There is no such thing as an issue which is not of concern to local people.
Question is on the amendment as proposed by Mr. Elwell. Ms. Johnson.
Ronnie Johnson, District 3. I just have a question. If we change as part of this amendment shall to may, isn't that a substantive issue? And are we supposed to decide on those things here, or are they new issues that have to be warned and decided later?
Mr. Fisher's interrogated.
Yes, it is a substantive change, and these articles are subject to amendment, so while it is up to the moderator to rule whether that is in order or not, in my opinion, it's up for debate. But obviously subject to being overturned here.
No, I think the substitution is in order, but it's the vote that's going to count. Yes, Ms. Stark.
Billy Stark, District 1. I'm not in favor of Corky's amendments, basically because I know all you people on the select board, and maybe you like me, maybe you don't, maybe I've talked to you too much or not enough. But if I came and bring a petition to you, and you feel it's not worth your time, you can deny it. And I don't want you to have that power. If we have 450 people that sign something, I think you should be listening to them. And maybe it's not something that you feel is of interest to the town, so it can bypass you, as Orion said. Go right through, stamp it, it's on the thing, it gets brought up to the town. It's important to somebody here because 500 people signed the petition. So whether or not you feel it's important doesn't really matter to me. It matters to the people of the town what they feel is important. And I don't think you should have the power to deny that if we have the signatures. So I'm in favor of the article as it's written by the Charter Commission, and I hope you'll vote against Corky's amendments.
Question is on Mr. Elwell's First Amendment. Mr. Sprite.
I think Mr. Cox made a good point, and that is that the net effect of this amendment as proposed, not the amendment, the underlying article as proposed actually takes away a little bit of the people's power to bring articles before the town, which I think is practical. I don't necessarily like it, but I think it's practical, and I think that the way it's played out in the past is that when there is a single issue on a certain thing, that we can get not necessarily a good sense of the town because not enough of people show up to voice their opinion. So in that sense, I think it actually does perhaps promote better democracy to have that taken away. I think all of this really comes down to whether we sit here feeling like the select board should or shouldn't have the ability, right, to veto petitions that come before them. And we can parse the language all day long. I think we're wasting our time. I think there are those of us here who feel like a petition that comes before the select board should be passed straight through, and others who feel like the select board should have a say in it. And we could spend all day at this, and I'm not sure how many people's minds are going to be changed. But I thought, just to reiterate, I feel like Mr. Cox made a good point, and that is that I think it really was an even-handed attempt to clarify something that I thought was clear to begin with, and I'm disappointed to hear that the Supreme Court at times has not felt like it was that clear. But I guess our charter hasn't been tested yet to that level. I would hope that it doesn't get tested to that level. I would hope that we would speak here very clearly that a petition is a petition, and the people who bring forward a petition are legitimate representatives of our town as much as anybody who sits on the select board or sits here today with us in the among the reps. I have no interest in, yes, Dora. I won't move the question because I can't, because I've spoken, but I would really like to, if we could get a straw vote or something to move this along, I don't think anybody's mind's being changed.
Question is on the amendment of Mr. Elwell. Are you ready for that question? If so, let me state the amendment. It's two-pronged. The first is in Section 2 of Article 3 to take out the word shall and replace it with the word may, and then to strike the last sentence in Section 2 or Paragraph 2 of Section 2. All in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise, remain standing until counted. The amendment fails. We're back to the next article, or next amendment, which is in Section 2 of Article 3, in Paragraph 4, to strike out the words national and the word international. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The amendment is defeated. The recurring question is, shall Article 18 be approved? Are you ready for that question? If so, all in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted.
Point of order. Sir, please clarify on what you're voting on.
We're voting on the article itself. Shall you adopt Article 18? I'm going to ask the checkers to please do the counting, please. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor, 57. Those opposed, 26. And you've adopted Article 18. Article 19. Chair recognizes Mr. Coram.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town lower the required number of voters' signatures from 20% to 10% in order to petition for inclusion in the warning of an article to adopt an ordinance.
Is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded that the town lower the required number of voter signatures from 20% to 10% in order to petition for the inclusion of in the warning of an article to adopt an ordinance. Mr. Block.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Last week, I had the opportunity to spend a couple of hours in the town vault, courtesy of Annette, and I searched the public records back to 1984. Thank you for that sound effect. In order to look and see in the public records what actions have occurred legislatively here in the town, whether brought by the town voters or by the select board or by whomever. and found and accounted for all of those actions since 1984, 27 years. Now, we just discussed the non-binding initiative section. There were actually 31 non-binding initiatives brought forth in 27 years, an average of one a year. But now we come to the article on binding initiatives, the ability for voters to bring forth a question to adopt an ordinance subsequent to a townwide vote, which is also subsequent to a vote by this body. It has several checks and balances built into it already. Currently, the threshold is 20% in order to bring forth such a petition, which initially gets brought to this body for discussion and decision. There have been 0 such petitions brought forth in 27 years of that authority being in our charter. 0. For those that are going to say, wait a second, this is micromanaging, this is giving too much power to the people, this is not the intention of a representative democracy, I say that the check and balance of this particular provision in the charter is a little bit out of step with reality. Reality is that it's not an overused authority at all. It's not used. And one of the reasons is that a 20% bar is exceptionally high. Nearly 2,000 registered voters in this town need to petition in order to just bring the question to the representative town meeting body. And only if this body approves that question does it then get sent to the voters for final discussion and a vote by Australian ballot. The Commission's recommendation, therefore, and I believe this is more consistent with what other towns that have such authority, and certainly a lot of other states have, is to reduce the bar from 20 to 10%, so that if there is a time, a moment in time, and it may only be an occasional moment, obviously, where citizens feel it's urgent that we adopt an ordinance here in Brattleboro and recommend such through petition to this body, that they have a reasonableness in terms of their pathway to navigate through.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 19? Are you ready for that question? Mr. DeGray.
You know, sometimes you wonder what drives these questions. And Larry Block said this provision has never been used, and so we are going to lower the standard. And then I look at the recall section here in the charter, where it talks about 25% of you needing to sign a petition to recall a select board member. Now, there's institutional memory in here, Marshall being one since he was born and raised here, probably Bertie Sprague. I don't know of any select board member who has been recalled. And so if we're just using the analogy, well, we're going to lower the standard because no one's ever used it before, and when you're re-examining the charter, one would have thought that, well, no one's ever recalled a select board member, maybe we should lower the standard. And let me just say to that, if you are planning on recalling me, make sure that you bring me the petition first, because I want to sign it. So before you say, yeah, this is great and wonderful, applying the same standard and having consistency, applying apples to apples, should have been applied through the whole charter, and it wasn't. So using an analogy because no one hasn't, let's lower the standard, is not a good reason to change the number from 20 to 10%, and so I'm going to vote against this.
Question is on Article 19. Mr. Dundon.
When you make the bar prohibitive, it's a fait accompli.
Question is on Article 19. Are you ready for that question? If so, Mr. Sprite.
I think Selectman DeGray has a point, and I would like to move to amend this article to include the one he referenced with the same percentages. I don't think there's an article for that one separately.
Point of order, I do not think that Mr. Sprite's motion is germane to this article here. In fact, if anything, it probably would have to be taken up under Article 34, and I might include town meeting members in there and having a recall petition on them also.
Sure, why not?
I think,
yeah, I think we should all be subject to that.
Here, here.
I think, Mr. Sprite, it makes more sense to take that up separately when we get to Article 34. That's one of the technical articles, and at that point you can re-offer your
okay, thank you.
Your amendment at that time. Mr. Block.
Just to address Mr. Corum's point, the reason the recommendation is being brought forth is not because it has never been utilized as an authority. It's simply to illustrate that where some fear a reckless mob rule direct democracy environment a la the proposition system in California, I don't think we have anything seriously to worry about by lowering the standard.
Question is on Article 19. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Goodmont?
Gary Goodemout from District 3. Larry, in your time in the vault, did you discover any, see that for the petition to change town plan, zoning bylaws, or subdivision regs, were there, do you know of situations where that happened? Because that's a 10% standard.
The answer is that that authority has only been present in our charter for the last, I believe, 4 years, and there have been 0 petitions brought forth to exercise that authority.
So I guess where my question comes from there is I wonder for day-to-day living that, you know, people may get excited about those kind of issues as well as you know, the ordinance adoption. And I just wonder if that's a 10% standard, and I wonder, you know, if that would be any effect of that not having been used. Like
I think it's an indication that it's not going to be well exercised even at 10%. Only if there really is a serious lack of response by the currently elected select board, which is the easiest pathway to bring forth a binding ordinance or binding initiative, they can do it in response to public outcry. But lacking that, there could be a situation once in a blue moon that the public feels strongly about, where their representatives are not listening and they want to bring such a question forward to this body and then ultimately to the voters.
Thank you.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 19? Mr. Mccarty.
Scott Mccarty, District 3. This comes down to the, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I see no reason to change this. And frankly, if we are going to be putting forward a binding, something that is binding to the town, I want to make sure that there is enough support behind it that actually warrants a special townwide vote. 10% I don't think really warrants a townwide vote. I'd like to see 20%, especially if it is changing something dramatically, like a binding resolution, about public nudity or something like that. I think we should definitely be, if that would, I think we all get what I'm trying to say here. But like the point is, it is apt to keep it at 20. I just think that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It served us well, and I would urge folks to vote no on this. Thank you.
Question is on the article, Ms. Baboulas.
I just want to speak to the issue of, for folks that are concerned that 10% might be too low. As somebody who has been involved in a number of petition campaigns, it's not easy to get all of those signatures. In the normal places where you can go, where are the public places where you can get signatures, you can get up to the 450 to 500. And then you really have to engage in a door-to-door canvass, because you can't do it at the post office and the co-op, which are the two real public places where you can go, and going to the meetings and getting people to sign it. So we're talking about a major, someone has to mount a major campaign to be able to do it. So it's not like it's that easy for people. And again, then you vote on it. So anything, I mean, whether it's 10%, 20%, 5%, I mean, the 20% really is just under what normally votes, what the number, the percentage that normally votes in a town meeting election. And that really doesn't make any sense, to require nearly everybody that usually votes in an election to sign a petition in order to get something to bring to a vote.
Question is on adopting Article 19, Mr. Cox.
Again, I want to make sure that I understand kind of where we are currently and what changes this makes. Currently, 20%, a petition with 20% comes up for an ordinance. That then goes to a town meeting, which is a town-wide vote. It does not come to representative town meeting. What I understand is being proposed is that lowering that limit to 10%, but that if a petition is receives that, then there would be a convening of representative town meeting to consider that ordinance. Is that
Mr. Brock is interrogated.
No, that's not correct. The 20% signature process is subsequently followed by a representative town meeting discussion and decision, and only an affirmative vote at that meeting will then bring it to a town-wide vote.
Mr. Cox.
Now, I understand that is the intent of the revisions, but as I read the current charter, I don't see anything about representative town meeting.
That's going back to where we don't have those words inserted, representative versus general, but according to, and you can interrogate Bob, that the town meeting words there mean representative town meeting.
Mr. Fisher?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. That is correct, and if you look at the subsection D of Article 3, Section 2A, 2D, talks about a binding initiative passed by the representative town meeting, then goes to the voters of the town. So it is, well, we tried in the technical amendments and based on what was voted on with representative town meeting and general town meeting, that's to clarify some of that, but it was fairly clear in this as it exists right now.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 19, Mr. Beatty?
Bob Beatty, District 1. I think especially because the big concern here, I would think, would be that 10% might be, we're going to be subject to California type shifts and everything. But considering that, the question still has to come before this esteemed deliberative body before it goes to the voters. I really think that's quite an adequate check and balance, and that you know, it won't be frivolous things and it won't be crazy things, and you know, I think, and also as somebody who's collected, you know, 500 signatures over several weeks, I know how difficult that is. It ain't easy to do 1,000 or 900 or whatever it is. So I think there would have to be substantial support to it, and that we could have a check and balance from mob rule with this body. So I think it's a good idea. Thanks.
Question is on adopting Article 19. Are you ready for that question? If so, Mr. Davis.
I think this is a great conversation to be having. Andy Davis, District 3. I'm just wondering, we recently had an issue that is related to this, where decisions that affect the whole town are made, and we had an issue that involved a petition, it involved an election, and it involved many hours of deliberation by this body. And I'm just curious, and this may be totally out of place, but at least I can say it for people's pondering. We discussed an issue regarding solid waste for probably 5 or 6 hours. I don't even want to mention what the issue was. But we did, and we made a decision, and the select board actually agreed, and there was a compromise made. Then there was a petition that was initially rejected by the select board on various grounds, and then I believe a compromise was worked out. And at one point, the select board said they would essentially treat that election as a binding initiative. And it never involved anything close to 20% of the people in this town signing the petition. So I think this is a great conversation to be having, because it has to do with our valuable time. There was an issue where we deliberated, we made a decision, and then through the petition process and a decision made by the select board, that became a binding, essentially an ordinance level decision that overrode the deliberation of this body. So I think it's really good we're having this conversation, and if it's germane to this, I'd love to have someone on the select board say, how did that become a decision to make that a binding election after this body had made a decision with the select board? I'm just curious if anyone can cast light on that or leave it alone. Thank you.
Does that issue is going to come up in the next article, and I don't know, Mr. Davis, if you would object. Let's get through this article. It's going to come up under Article 20, and then we can get this one passed. Yes. Mr. Wiesel.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Tim Wessel, District 3. I just wanted to say very quickly, in response to Mr. Mccarty's statement, if this has never been used in all of those years, as Larry pointed out, I think it is broke. I think there's definitely something wrong if there's an article, there's a right of the people that has never been exercised. So I would see this as making it a little less broke, maybe. And that's what we should try to do. And let's not fear the people so much. I think there's a lot of that going on, but we're the people, so we're not scary.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 19? Mr. Finnell.
Tom Finnell, District 3. I'd just like to address the concept of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We don't do that with our cars, most of us. It's called preventive maintenance. You try to fix something before it breaks. It's a lot easier and a lot less costly. That's all I wanted to say.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 19? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor of adoption kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you've adopted the resolution. Article 20. Chair recognizes Mrs. O'Connor.
Mr. Moderator, I move that the town include votes taken on subsidiary motions as subject to referendum.
Is there a second? Motion is made and seconded that the town include votes taken on subsidiary motions as subject to referendum. Mr. Block.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And I guess this is recent history to most of you that what prompted this discussion among the commissioners and subsequently our first recommendation in this section of referendum is the lack of clarity, again, lack of specificity in our charter when addressing what it is that is subject to referendum subsequent to an action by the representative town meeting body. I know this is a pretty debatable question and probably will get all the way till lunch debating this, but what we've recommended that subsidiary motions are subject to referendum if you adopt this recommendation, and the reason being is an obvious one, is that not allowing oversight or the check and balance of the public to decisions made here seems antithetical to democracy, and so the recommendation here with the new language simply adds that any vote, including but not limited to votes taken on subsidiary motions, be subject to referendum. I would like to add one historical view, is that there have only been 2 referenda in 27 years ever brought forward by citizens. And once again, I don't think that our citizenry takes lightly the responsibility they have when it comes to making a review of something that they feel is important enough that the whole town should be able to consider it. Thank you.
Shall you adopt Article 20 as the issue? Are you ready for that? Ms. Sunday.
Thank you. The concern with this is that when you have subsidiary motions, so you have a motion and then there's a motion to amend, and then there may be another motion to amend. I think we've seen it here. You can have multiple motions to amend that can build on one another. If one of those subsidiary motions is then taken to referendum, the problem becomes how does that impact those following amendments? You could end up with contradictory motions. You could end up with a final action by the representative town meeting that then one of the subsidiary motions gets taken to referendum and it changes, and it can be very difficult to figure out, and as staff, pretty much being the person who's trying to work to figure out how they work together. I think that it's interesting because there was a lot of discussion with regard to, before coming to bringing the charter amendments to this body, there were members of the commission who had asked the town attorney, they were concerned about there being amendments made to the charter questions for that exact reason, because you could end up with contradictory results, and then somebody has to figure out how those get reconciled. There are times when I do believe it is really important to follow legal advice. I do believe that our town attorney has stated and has had many conversations with the Charter Commission of concerns about this. I think that maybe if you want to clarify it, it should be clarified to say the final action of representative town meeting, but to allow motions on subsidiary, to allow referenda on subsidiary motions is going to, I think you're going to end up with things going to court, and they're going to be decided by court system and not by the people. And before I'm accused of being afraid of the people, I'm not afraid of the people. I am one of the few people in this town whose bosses change by the will of the people every year. You wouldn't last very long as town manager if you were afraid of people. But I am concerned that decisions that are made at this body, that when they go to referendum, if they're not on that final action, that some of the decisions are going to end up being made not by the people, but by the court system.
Shall you adopt Article 20? Mr. McCarty.
Scott McCarty, District 3. I want to take up, if everyone looks at the little handout that the town manager's office provided us, I agree with Barb, so what I would like to do is I would like to amend Article 3, Section 4 to say, the voters of the town may petition for a referendum by Australian ballot of all voters of the town on the final vote on a warned article taken by representative town meeting. So I would amend it to that.
Mr. McCarty, do you have that in writing?
Yes.
Where did he put it? Mr. McCarty moves, and there's been a second, that Section 4 be amended to read, the voters of the town may petition for a referendum by Australian ballot of all the voters of the town on the final vote on a warned article taken by representative town meeting. Mr. Block.
I'd like to interrogate our town attorney on that. Is that substantially any different than the current charter language?
With regard to it being substantially different, it clarifies by saying putting in the words final vote is the way I would interpret Mr. McCarty's amendment here, because as it currently states, it says on any action of the, gotta make sure I'm looking at the, but it currently says any action, so the final vote would be a clarifying amendment.
Thank you. Then may I?
You may proceed.
I think the fear, and once again, there's fear in the air, that somehow or another the public is not going to be able to discern the difference between a subsidiary motion that is just a part of a whole and something that is a whole that has gotten lodged into a subsidiary motion. That is the effect of our recommendation. There is a way for the select board, or for even perhaps this body, I'm not quite sure of your rules, whereby the substance of a decision is submerged in a subsidiary motion and the public can't get at it. I think that is essentially what we're responding to, is that on the pay-as-you-throw discussion, there was no mechanism that allowed people to basically say, wait a second, we just want to be able to decide such an important change as a whole, and we believe we should have the right to access it through a referendum. I don't think the public is going to misuse, once again, such an authority by dealing with trivial things instead of really substantial issues.
Questions on the proposed amendment? Mr. Fisher?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I just want to bring up, as Barb Sondag mentioned, sort of the procedural impacts concerning referendums that deal with subsidiary motions. If a subsidiary motion, if there's the ability to take that by referendum to a vote of the voters of the town, they vote on that. Then my question is, what happens? if there's no change, then obviously all of the subsequent motions to amend and the final action taken by representative town meeting would stay the same. But if that referendum changes what the vote was on whatever subsidiary motion, in my opinion, you then have to warn a representative town meeting and come back and take up that article from where you left off. And so from the procedural standpoint, think about how many times with motions to amend and then another motion to amend, and if all of those, if one goes up and then we come back, we have another representative town meeting. There could be other motions there. So I don't want to be one of these, it's not intended to be fear-mongering, which I think is being thrown around rather lightly today, but from the procedural standpoint of think about whether this dilutes or not representative form of government. Thank you.
Question is on the Mccarty amendment. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Barber.
Thanks, Mr. Moderator. Orion Barber, District 1. I have to say, I've never quite understood why we, the Commission, recommended this change. And I like Mr. McCarty's amendment. I think it clarifies it. I'm hearing what Barbara is saying and what Bob is saying, and the whole business of subsidiary amendments sounds like the worst possible thicket to hack through.
Words that I see in that amendment that concern me relate to the warned article. And it seems to me that one of the points of discussion on last year's question was relating to how could we get to the substance of the decision. And my understanding, I may be incorrect about this, but the decision that we made was actually the budget, even though underneath that we were having a discussion about pay-as-you-throw. So pay-as-you-throw, as I understand it, last year was not actually a warned article. So it wouldn't have qualified by this amendment to then be something that would be subject to a town referendum. I wonder if you could clarify that. And I support the general idea of the major actions of this group being able to be questioned by the larger population.
Mr. Fisher is interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. You are correct that that was the budget article, and that article, as it may be amended upwards, downwards to include whatever people wanted in the budget or not, that was subject to referendum as a final vote. And if the people who wanted essentially a referendum on the pay-as-you-throw particular issue could have sought a referendum on the final vote on the budget, so that the budget itself would have gone to the voters. And then in the lead up to that, you'd have lots of editorials back and forth in the paper, and then you'd have the vote. But does that answer your question?
I wonder if there's a way of clarifying this amendment or changing the wording of the amendment so we really talk about substantive actions of this group, not including but not necessarily limited to warned articles. In that it seems that occasionally this group might make an important decision on a major action that was not a warned article.
Mr. Fisher or Ms. Sunday?
We could change that, and perhaps Mr. McCarty with a friendly amendment would say on the final votes, just so that the word, I think your intent there, if I'm correct, is on the word final votes, and this confusion over the warrant article, the meeting can't make decisions on items which are not germane to warrant articles. That's not to say that a warrant article can't be amended, as we see that all the time, especially with budgets. Budgets are amended upwards, downwards, several times over in a typical meeting. So either to say final votes or on the final vote on a warrant article as amended, if amended.
Ms. Sundag?
It appears to me as though the charter is the Constitution, and we're trying to make some changes to the charter about a particular issue that occurred, when in reality, how that particular issue, in this case pay-as-you-throw, was handled should have been handled differently. And I don't necessarily think we should try to get to that problem through the charter changes. I think what should have happened is we should have put pay-as-you-throw as a separate article question, and that was really the issue. Had it been it could have been a separate article question. The complicator with doing that is that it was kind of this larger amount in the budget. But I think that's actually, and I think that's actually probably what would have changed it, would have made it easier. We got to it, and again, sometimes you know, after I think somebody said 5 hours of discussion on pay-as-you-throw, one of the things that happened was actually, if you look at the subsidiary motion that was made at that representative town meeting, that was actually then taken up as a separate, as under referendum. Actually, had we been on our toes and had it not been probably, I don't know, 4 o'clock by that point, someone would have realized that that actual motion wasn't even within the bounds of the representative town meeting, because it was particular to a particular line item. And it probably, if a point of order would have been made, that would have changed it. And so we're kind of going back and looking at a particular one time thing and trying to change the charter for it. I'm just not sure if that's necessarily the appropriate way to do it, or do you change where the actual problem was?
Questions on the Mccarty amendment? Are you ready for that question? Ms. Boubulis?
Thank you. I actually brought to the commission the actual change I think that needs to be made is not necessarily the language associated with whether or not something can go to a referendum, but whether or not the select board is required to place things that change service substantially to be a separate article. And that's the actual language that should be put into the charter, because otherwise the select board can bury anything in a total budget vote, and thus making it difficult for people to address just one particular change in service. And you know, you're not talking about all changes in service, but certainly pay-as-you-throw is a substantial change in service, and really should have been its own article. And that would have obviously, as Barb said, fixed everything, because people would have been able to petition on that one article. But you know, there should be some sort of bar set within the charter that says this should be a separate article and this should be included in the budget. And I think that the charter, you know, should be guiding the select board on that decision.
Question is on the Mccarty amendment. Mr. Elwell.
I agree with Barb's analysis of this issue. It could lead to really a whole snake's nest of subsidiary issues, if you will. And therefore, I'm glad to see that at least one other member of the commission agrees that this article should be voted no.
Question is on the Mccarty amendment. Are you ready for that question? Yes. Mr. Penniman.
Just to make sure I understand what we're doing, I understand the first sentence in the referendum in section 4 is going to be replaced with the new words, and the second section will the second sentence will still stand, or are we replacing the whole paragraph?
It's my understanding that the proposal of amendment would read, the voters of the town may petition for a referendum by Australian ballot of all voters of the town on the final vote as a warned article taken by representative town meeting.
That's the 5 to 10 is the next question. Is Article 21.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is that such petition shall be filed within 10 days? That's going to remain? Or is this amendment going to replace all of it?
That's the next article question.
That's net. Thank you.
There are two. We're on 20. They're separate. They've been separated out.
So the amendment is to replace only the first sentence?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's correct. Are you ready for that question? Mr. Gavi.
I too feel a concern. I share a concern that there's a potential for a lot of confusion, of kind of slipping into sort of a quagmire when you begin to talk about motions and amendments and subsidiary, etc. But what we have in front of us is very simple and clear. It just says all subsidiary motions. We have seen here in this meeting just a little while ago, we had accepted the moderator's decision to consider a very substantial modification in a charter paragraph when we were talking about the 5, 10, 15%. And so it seems it's not entirely clear what is and isn't very substantial, but we do know that there is a real possibility that very substantial decisions can be made here in a subsidiary motion. It feels to me very much like this town meeting, that the people of this town should keep that power to themselves to be able to decide on anything that it considers very important. And risk, I think it's much less of a risk than it is a greater benefit. It's much more of a benefit than it is a risk that we keep that power until the select board or some other party comes back with next year a much more clearly written charter paragraph that will address this issue and find some way for us to distinguish between major and minor decisions or changes. So I recommend that we just leave it as is, because in fact over the next year there is very little threat, and just wait until we can decide on something that we all understand.
Question is on the Elwell amendment, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Don Webster, District 3. This issue has become more and more important as this discussion goes on to me. Because clearly, I was one of those, by the way, who supported the lower limits for petitions and everything else that we voted on here today. But I've come to the conclusion it's very important that we pass the amendment that's proposed by Mr. Carty, because I hear more and more discussion, and sort of reflecting on what Orion said and the confusion you referred to, Barbara. It sounds to me like basically this is getting at the very heart of representative town meeting. If you cut all the way through it, it's saying we're not going to trust the people in town meeting, even to make mistakes as we go along. So as we get going further into discussion, let's really consider whether this body is an appropriate body to make decisions for the community as was originally set up by the charter and has served us well for 35 years. So I strongly urge the passage of this amendment.
Question is on the Mccarty amendment. Mr. Wilderman?
John Wilmerding, District 3. I would just like again briefly to invoke the spirit of the people and the principle of direct democracy. When those who voted to create a representative town meeting abandoned part of direct democracy, I don't think they were voting for the creation of a body that would then vote for more power for itself. And I would like to ask the members of this body to please bear that point of wisdom in mind.
Question is on the Mccarty amendment. Are you ready for that question? If Mr. Block.
Don, you couldn't have put it any better. You said that we really ought to trust our representatives to make mistakes, and we do. It's simply a matter of, is it reasonable to have a corrective action pathway if it is perceived that a mistake has been made and that the significant majority of the people in town see it a different way for the benefit of all?
Question is, Mr. Barber.
I hope you don't rule me out of order. I think this is the right question to ask, to vote on, and I like the amendment, but Dora has it right, I believe. The whole brouhaha arose out of the fact that pay-as-you-throw was not a separate article, and I may have missed it. I miss a lot of things these days, but I remember trying to figure out some way to have the charter say to a select board, you can't do that. It's got to be a separate article. Don't bury it in the budget. I couldn't figure it out, and we as a commission, I don't think, could. So that's the problem. If Dora has the perfect language, or somebody else does, it ought to be brought to a charter revision commission, and we ought to fix that because we can save ourselves a lot of grief.
Question is on Article 20 in the amendment proposed by Mr. Mccarty. Are you ready for that question? Yes. The amendment proposed by Mr. Mccarty is to first paragraph of Section 4, referendum. It would be to strike out the first sentence, and it would read, in lieu thereof, the following: the voters of the town may petition for a referendum by Australian ballot of all voters of the town on the final vote on a warrant article taken by representative town meeting. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. I think I would like to have the checkers count, please. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of the amendment, 64. Those opposed, 16. So the amendment carries. And the recurring question now is, shall you adopt Article 20 as amended? All in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. You may be seated. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes have it, and the article is adopted. Article 21. Chair recognizes Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town increase the referendum filing requirements from 5 to 10 days, while also increasing the number of signatures required to bring forth a referendum from 250 voters to 5% of the voters.
Is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded. Chair recognizes Mr. Block.
These two recommendations contained in one article kind of balance each other. That was the Commission's view. Certainly we agreed that a 5-day period for petitioning for referendum seemed like a potentially too short a period of time, particularly if weather prohibits such an action by our citizenry. However, because we felt referenda should be subject to a reasonably high bar, we have recommended an increase of the number of signatures required to be more consistent with similar provisions in the Charter, from 250 voters to 5%, which would be somewhat over 400 in the current makeup of our voter registry. So those two are taken together in our mind as one, increasing the time, but also increasing the bar. We made no recommended change to the number of town meeting members. 50 is the existing requirement as another pathway for petitioning for referendum.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 21? Are you ready for that question? If so, all in favor kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Point of order? I'm sorry. Mr. Dimes?
Thank you, sir. I move that we amend this motion. The numbers are only very superficially consistent with the rest of the chart. Namely, I'm referring to the 250 signatures being raised to 500. In the case of a referendum, it's obvious that the matters are already of interest to the public. One of the reasons for collecting signatures is to confirm that the matter is of interest to the public. If the matter has already been voted on by the town meeting, then surely it does not have to be established again that it is of interest to the public. So as things, an initiative, for instance, might be something that the public in general is not thinking about, and to get on the ballot, it's required approximately 500 signatures, the way the voting registry stands now. But if there's 500 or 460 for that, it ought to be less for a referendum, because we've already proven, we don't even have the debate, that it's already of interest. So I move that the change in the number of signatures be stricken from the amendment.
So, Mr. Dimes, you're saying that there will be no requirement for 5% of the voters to sign a petition?
Yes, sir. No new change in that part of the statute. It should stay at 250.
Okay. Mr. Dimes moves that the article be amended by striking 5% of the voters and in effect leaving in the language 250 voters. Is there a second? There is a second. Mr. Wheelock.
Marshall Wheelock, District 2. I'm rising to speak against the proposed amendment. While it is correct that the subject is already one of interest of the town voters, the question on the petition is not whether the subject is a point of interest, but whether the repeal of the decision is a point of interest. So I don't think that the reasoning holds up, and I'm suggesting that people vote against it.
Question is on the Dimes amendment. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor kindly rise and remain standing. Those opposed kindly rise and remain standing. The nays appear to have it. The nays do have it, and the amendment is defeated. The recurring question is, shall you adopt Article 21? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor kindly rise and remain standing. Those opposed kindly rise and remain standing. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you've adopted Article 21. No, we're going to 12:30. We're going to get this over. Well, we're going to go. Article 22. Chair recognizes Dora Baboulas.
Thank you. I move that the town approve the technical changes made to Article 3.
Is there a second? Mr. Block.
Again, as before, these are technical changes that the Commission made in Article 3.
Mr. Frick. I'm sorry, Mr. Frick Sprite.
Frick Sprite, District 3. Under technical changes, I see in Section 5, under recall, a change from, under Section 5E, a recall petition shall not be brought against an individual more than once within, it was 12 months and now has changed to 24 months. That seems different from a technical change. If that does qualify as a technical change, I would like to, at this point, propose that we technically make this consistent with other articles in this section in terms of the percentage of legal voters required.
So where would that amendment be?
I'd like to propose we amend it to the recall petition signed by 10% of the legal voters.
Okay. Mr. Sprite wishes to make a change to Section 5, subsection B. So it would read a recall petition signed by at least 10% of the voters. Okay. Is there a second to that? Okay. All in favor of the Sprite amendment from 25%?
Point of order, Mr. Moderator.
Yes. What? I'm sorry, Mr. Barber.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding here, but okay, the article we're dealing with is the technical changes to Article 3. And as far as I am aware, the Commission did not recommend an article changing the percentage of the voters for a recall petition. And that sounds to me like a major piece of business, not a technical one.
If you will look at the last section, section E, you have a recommendation of changing the number of months within, and if that counts as a technical change, I would suggest that changing the percentage would be equally relevant as a technical change.
I believe that should be under Article 34, other business. In other words, there is the authority here to bring forth substantial changes that were not addressed by the articles previous to them, but that is the place for it.
Okay.
This question only refers to non-substantial changes within the article. It's not the right place for your amendment, but your amendment still could be
Again, I would draw your attention to section E, where you guys have changed 12 months to 24 months. That is not a change in,
well,
that's not an editorial change, that's a substantial change.
Not according to our town attorney, who agreed that it was a technical change. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but otherwise it would have been a warrant article.
Well, perhaps it should have been then.
Perhaps.
I guess I would like to move that we either do that or leave the 12 as it was, because to me that's not a technical change.
Okay. Mr. Sprite, you're now requesting that in Section 5, in E, that we strike 24 months and put in 12 months. Is that correct?
Well, my first choice is to deal with the other issue now while we're in Section 3. But if we need to wait till Section 34, Article 34, I'm happy to do that. But that being the case, I would suggest that changing the number of months there is not just technical, although it may be relatively minor in the context. I would not call that technical.
Well, I think what I'm going to do is do it under Article, we'll do both things under, because there may be other things, under Article 33. Is that the one that, no. 34. No, that's right, that's other business. So we're going to take up both of them at this point, okay?
Okay.
To keep it consistent. Okay. The percentages that we're going to take up under Article 34. If you want to make a technical change on Article E and reduce it from 24 down to 12, we can do that now if you get a second. Okay. All in favor of the amendment of Article C to change the number from 24 months back to 12 months?
Yeah, okay.
Miss,
not change it is, I think, what we're trying to say.
Pardon me?
What we're trying to say is not change that part.
Not change it, right,
Yes.
okay.
In other words, leave it as it was.
Okay. Ms. Stark?
I'd just like a little clarification as to why it was changed to 24 on the advice of the attorney and how that qualifies as a technical change. I'm totally confused by that.
Mr. Fisher.
The 12 to 24 months was the Charter Commission's recommendation. As far as trying to go through all of their recommendations and parse them into articles, that one we didn't think it was going to rise to the level of being a substantive enough for a separate article, so we put it under the technical ones. Obviously, Mr. Sprite brings up that it is an issue, so we can deal with it through his amendment here. Hope that answers your question. It's just tough because there were so many different recommendations. You know, we still have 34 articles. We could have had 52 if we split them all out.
Question is on the recommendation made by Mr. Sprite. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor of the Sprite amendment signify by saying aye. Or stand, I'm sorry. Those opposed, kindly rise. The chair, under its eyesight, says it appears that the article is defeated.
Division.
Division has been requested. Always save the chair. Thank you. Mr. Sprite, what is your point of order?
Get to the mic. I think a couple people have suggested that these two things might well be taken up together under Article 34. No?
I've been advised by the council for the town, who's worked with the Charter Committee, that under the rules and the regulations they used, we've got to vote on the one that you first offered in this article. We'll take the next one up under Article 34. So all those in favor of the Sprite amendment to change the term from 24 back to its original 12 months term, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. I'm going to ask the checkers to count, please. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Listen to the result of your vote. Those in favor of the article to amend 36, those opposed 32. The article amendment is approved.
Point of order. We've lost our quorum. 68. Do we still have a quorum?
I assume that everybody who is here voted. Okay. I think at this time we're going to have a quorum vote. Would the checkers do a quorum vote of all the members, please? Just remain in your seats.
We're voting on the technical changes represented, capitalize R, capitalize
12 to 24
Yes.
is not a technical change. They could have had 100,000 articles, but they didn't put that in a separate article. But I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I think it should be a separate article. I just don't think it's a technical change. We can, I think we bring it up at the Article 34.
We do have a quorum, 85, so the last vote, which was 36 yes, 32 no, stands because there is a quorum present, and that's a majority of those who voted. Move on to the article itself. Do you wish to adopt Article 22 as amended? All those in favor kindly rise. Remain standing until those opposed kindly rise. Chair rules that the ayes have it, and Article 22 is adopted. Article 23, Chair recognizes Mr. Coram.
Mr. Moderator, I move we take a lunch break.
Larry, you want to do that to 1 o'clock? This one here. Based on the fact that it is noon, people may have other obligations to do during the noon hour, we'll take a recess until 1 o'clock. Please try to be as prompt as you can in returning.